Like most schools and departments at UCLA, the Luskin School of Public Affairs is committed to the value of information. We do that through thoughtful and thorough analysis of facts, evidence, and most importantly, words. For folks in the public policy department, if evidence is irrelevant to the policies that we choose, then why are we doing anything at all? We can just assert things. That's obviously a problem. It's a problem for empirically based social science. I think it's a problem for governance. And I think it's a problem that is likely to continue. We do have a circumstance in which all three branches of the federal government, all three elected branches, the two chambers of Congress and the presidency, the party in control of those units won less votes than the opposing party. That's true in the House, it's true in the Senate, it's true in the presidency. In order to preserve the institutional power, it's going to take extraordinary acts of political gymnastics. Beating up reporters might just be part of that. So we thought we should stop and consider this. We should think about what it means as we have a policy-making establishment moving past truth or fact or analysis in order to make policies. And we have a scorekeeper, a referee, the press, who's been under assault. So today, we proudly present some of the greatest minds in academia and journalism who will lead us through a discussion of what happens when the executive branch of our government tries to convince us that words don't matter. A May 10th poll by Quinnipiac University showed that 58% of Americans disapprove of the way the news media covers Donald Trump. But 65% of the same poll said they disapprove of the way Trump talks about the news media. And by a 57 to 31% margin, voters say they trust the media more than they trust the president. That was 2 weeks ago, which in Trump time is roughly equivalent to the Mesozoic or Paleozoic eras. As Dorothy says upon landing in Oz, people come and go so quickly here. Thankfully, we have great newspapers like the LA Times, the Washington Post, and the New York Times, among many other outstanding news outlets, to fulfill their roles in watchdogs over everything that transpires in Washington. While it might seem that the way with recent developments, this is nothing new, as Marty Baron, the editor of the Washington Post, said in a recent interview, we're very focused on the new administration, as we would be regardless of who occupied the White House. We have an administration that's very focused on disrupting and to some extent dismantling huge portions of the American government. That's a surpassingly important story for us. Well, no kidding. So we have to be paying attention. It is probably not hyperbole if I were to suggest that the press is the single most effective institution in the United States today at holding the current holders of political power accountable. I do not believe there is another. We hope our panel discussions today will help shed some light on why the news media's relationship with this president is an important story for all of us, regardless of party, ideology, or our personal views. We're honored to have outstanding representatives of academia and the news media here with us, and I'm looking forward to hearing what they have to say. Our first panel, the 2016 Campaign and Media Impact, will look back at the election campaign and ask what role, if any, the media played in the stunning upset win by Donald Trump on November the 8th. The moderator is Sasha Eisenberg, a journalist whose articles have been published in the New York Times Magazine, the Washington Monthly, the Atlantic, Slate, and the Boston Globe, among many others. He is the author of the book, The Victory Lab, The Secret Science of Winning Campaigns. We're fortunate to have him here today to lead our first panel. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Sasha Eisenberg.
I want to start, I guess, with Lynn, because you're probably the person who's given the most sustained thought to the big questions on the docket today about media and elections. And I think one of the big questions that political scientists in general, at least people who study elections, have been thinking about going back at least into the 40s is how much does media coverage affect the outcome of elections? Should we be thinking any differently about that question as it pertains to 2016 than we did presidential elections before it?
Thank you for that first and provocative question, Sasha, and thanks to the Luskin School for having all of us. I think the answer to that question is no. I want to say no. We should not be thinking any differently about how media affects election outcomes. And I'm going to put that in a really specific box. One of the things that scholars have known for quite a while is that the media doesn't really tell voters what to think, what positions to hold on issues, for example, but it does do a great job of telling voters what to think about, what is important today. For example, Gary just mentioned the reporter being allegedly assaulted. And so that's in the news. And so today, if you're paying attention to the news, you're thinking about that. They're not telling you what to think about it, but evidence suggests that they can set the agenda for you. And also give you a set of criteria on which to evaluate candidates. And so I think at that very basic level, set your agenda, give you the criteria, and frame topics for you. We saw that happen in 2016, I think in a lot of the way that we've seen it happen in the past. So in that very specific way, I'm going to say no, 2016 was not unusual.
Zev, we're now 100, Donald Trump never fails to remind us how many days we're into this administration, 120-something days. From a sort of policy perspective, how good, to the extent that campaigns should be useful to illuminate how people who win will govern after them. How good was the 2016 campaign in terms of giving us an idea of what a Trump administration would be like?
Well, I guess in one way you could say Trump was quite transparent. He said what he was going to do and really telegraphed how he was going to behave, and he's behaved the way he campaigned, if not more so. Overall, what troubled me about that campaign was that it set a new low for what constitutes acceptable discourse in the political realm in our country. I don't think it's a coincidence or an accident that a leading candidate for Congress in Montana, felt it was okay, and I'm sure he has some anger management problems and all, but there are a lot of people with anger management problems who wouldn't take a reporter down. I've lost my temper on occasion. It never occurred to me to take a reporter down. I wanted to, but I had enough self-control. I don't think it's an accident that happened several months after this campaign. And the kind of rhetoric, and we've seen it, the increase in racism and anti-Semitic graffiti on churches, on nonprofits, on synagogues, on mosques. It certainly can't be comfortable to be a Muslim these days in the United States, and it hasn't been for the last year in a big way. Well, I think Donald Trump unleashed something that obviously has been bubbling under the surface in a whole lot of dimensions and areas. When a leading candidate for president and a president-elect and then a president makes absurd and inflammatory and bigoted remarks, when he assaults the very institutions that are the underpinning of our democracy, the free press, the judiciary, when he seeks to ban entry into this country for people of one religion, he's the leader. There are millions of people in this country who may agree with what he's saying but would never have dared suggested implementing such a policy, who now say, well, the president says it's okay. The president attacks the press. I'm sick and tired of this reporter in Montana. I've had enough of him. I'm going to take him down. This is manifest in so many ways in our society now. I think that was the initial damage that this campaign did. Now, the longer he's in, and to the extent he is successful in doing what he has laid out and his people have laid out as their agenda and their vision, there's a lot more damage to come.
Laura?
I want to challenge this narrative just a little bit. The press largely did not take Trump seriously and built him up, and partly because he was a very interesting candidate. I think that there was a sense that he was a great candidate to cover. It certainly drove ratings, which then probably caused them to lean in a little bit to wanting to cover him. Was there an equivalency in terms of their coverage with other candidates? I don't think it was equal. And Trump made that difficult because he was colorful and said things that, again, caused you to cover it. But we keep coming back to this equivalency issue, and I do think this campaign was different. Once Once he became the candidate, then there became a desire to create an equivalency between the two candidates when maybe there weren't. The kinds of campaigns that were running, the kinds of truths that were being told were very different. So I do think that in order to understand how we then cover this presidency and this world going forward, we do need to look back and take have some greater understanding of how the media was building this phenomenon a little bit.
I'm curious about the equivalency argument, because there are 17 candidates running. They don't all deserve equal coverage. And so Trump is leading in the polls from just a few weeks after he announces. He is the front runner. And so would we have said the same thing about Mitt Romney as a front runner, that he was getting too much coverage? Now, maybe there's an imbalance there that is greater than there was in 2012, but I'm not sure how should we think about who deserves to be equal?
Well, I do think I'm probably pointing more at television coverage than print coverage. Television coverage ran the entirety of Trump's speech every time. I assume the obligation of the campaign was not to make news in that way. The obligation of the campaign was to repeat the message over and over again until people could really hear it. And sometimes that meant you were not breaking news, but you were repeating your message in front of crowds that were then being.
And so essentially, you're saying that he effectively manipulated the media into
I'm just
covering
saying
things.
he
I mean, is
changed
that the point?
I'm not saying that the media was complicit in it. I'm saying he has changed the rules of all debate and all coverage in this way, and I think there's a little bit of playing catch-up to that reality.
I think the media was totally complicit in it, and don't forget it for a minute. The article in the New York Times Magazine a few weeks ago, or a few months ago, on Jeff Zucker and CNN. CNN had its biggest profit margin in the history of CNN in the year 2016, largely attributable to their wall-to-wall coverage, morning, dusk to dawn, dawn to dusk coverage of Donald Trump. Does anybody here ever remember Meet the Press having a candidate on the air by telephone? Not once, but time after time after time. I've never seen it. Lawrence E. Spivak has to be turning in his grave. Tim Russert, I would like to believe, would never have allowed it to happen. MSNBC, the liberal network. I'd come home, I'd turn on the TV, and Chris Matthews was just finishing his hour. He wasn't on. It was Trump giving a speech at the football stadium in Mobile, Alabama, and they don't even take the time to introduce Chris Hayes. It's just a seamless transition. You have a little crawl on the bottom of the screen. This went on day after day after day, and I think, Trump may not be a rocket scientist like our former chancellor, but he does have instincts for how to make news and keep himself in the news, whatever the cost is. I analogize this to, from a political point of view, to a car chase. This was a political car chase. They can't stop covering it. Why? Because we all watch it. And it's the people who made that happen, that drove the ratings up, it drove the advertising revenues up, and so it goes. All of the networks went up in revenue in 2016, the cable networks. And so I think back to the early presidential campaigns in my lifetime. I mean, it's silly to compare because they're incomparable. But Walter Cronkite, Chet Huntley, Frank Reynolds, Peter Jennings, I can't believe that if they had any control over this is not the journalism they grew up in. So it's a new paradigm now.
And people did respond to it. To Zev's point, the game has changed. It's not the Walter Cronkite world anymore. And news media organizations are expected to fill the space. And now with internet news being a way that many, many people get their news on their mobile devices, on their computers, they want it 24/7. And media organizations, for better and worse, have tried to step into that breach and supply that information. So I would agree that the news judgment, I think, has fallen off significantly. I think it's difficult when you're looking at, 17 or 22 candidates for the Republicans, who's going to rise above. You have to take a look at how they're being funded. You have to take a look at polls. We can talk about polls too, which is something else I think that's interesting. You have to find a way to give people as much information as possible. I feel that it's an important part of our public service role to make sure that people are informed about who the candidates are, but at what point do you break away and say, we're just not going to travel with so-and-so anymore? We're not going to cover that person. Sometimes that depends on the support from within the party. You know, are they getting support from other people in the Republican Party to keep elevating them, and then people slowly start to break out and
Did
you
you
put
think
more?
this year that coverage did a good job of assessing
No.
that? No.
No, I don't. I think, again, to Zev's point, it was sort of like anytime, you know, Trump got in front of a camera, let's just turn the camera on him and let it roll, without, you know, an opportunity to ask any kind of questions.
So I just want to jump in and, you know, I guess, I can't even believe this, but defend a little bit cable news. But, you know, like, I can imagine a world in which Donald Trump, who pretty much every Republican who was running against him and Hillary Clinton all made the same decision. They looked at him as a candidate and they said, that guy? Really? That guy's never going to win. And so he was unusual, and he had an unusual media tactic for sure. You know, win the news cycle every day. All news is good news. All press coverage is good press coverage. He's different than any politician or candidate that we've seen, you know, in memory. But the guy became president of the United States and was the leader in the Republican poll from, you know, nearly the beginning to the end. And at several points in the general election, closed the gap and became, you know, very close to being the front runner of the general election. And let's just imagine a world in which he wins and CNN or MSNBC, whoever, had not played his rallies beginning to end, where he was every day saying outrageous things, calling people Pocahontas, all the inflammatory things that you all know he said at these rallies. Then the claim would be, we'd be sitting up here saying, this man became president because nobody in the media told us what the hell he was saying every day. And we'd be critiquing them on a different score. And so I think it's one thing to say, like, he was on TV 24/7 and that's what made him president. That is not true. Okay. And we'd be sitting here saying that he was not on TV at all, and that's why he became president, if they hadn't done
But
it.
isn't the role of the media to both set the context for what is happening with this and to challenge the veracity of what these candidates are saying? And so it has only become, since he's elected and frankly proven that he lies on a regular basis, and that the New York Times and but it was not as in vogue to call them
That's not
lies
true.
when he was
Oh,
running.
that's-
But if you looked at the television coverage of the others, it was the whole rally. There was not any, there were not chyrons that said, you know, this isn't true, which you do actually see now. I believe that there has been a shift in the way that he is covered so that when those things happen, they're called out a little bit more.
Even if they had been called out, I think what's so difficult for many of us to deal with, both, you know, from a public policy standpoint and in the media, is people didn't care. He lied, he continues to lie, people voted for him, they didn't care. And that is hard for us to get our minds, it's hard for me to get my mind around, but that's the truth.
What is, like, what would the ideal be for how the voices of politicians get passed
Oh,
along to voters?
You didn't pay me enough to tell you what the solution is. I'm just going to do the critique. No, here's my problem with this. I'm not really, I understand the media. You know, MSNBC has to cover him gavel to gavel because CNN's covering him gavel to gavel. And CNN's got to do it because Fox is doing it. They just, and it was a slot machine that was paying off on every thing. For every hour that we covered Trump, nobody else got covered. So I feel for there was a weak crop of candidates. I mean, none of them were able, even when they narrowed down to a few candidates, were able to stand up to his bullying.
When they did, we've been trying to sort this out. So, for example, when he makes the comment about Carly Fiorina, look at that face, is that the face of the president? And she comes back that next week or whatever and says, you know, Mr. Trump, I think every woman in America knew exactly what you meant. She soars in the media. She gets a boost in media
That's
coverage.
a good, I agree with you on that.
And so she takes it to him, and she gets coverage. And then Sasha and I talked about this a couple weeks ago, and then she shuts up. And she doesn't say it again. And she doesn't get 1,000 women in T-shirts saying, I love my face, to march down Fifth Avenue and stand in front of Trump Tower. Like, if she had played his game,
And she dropped in the
she would have
polls.
and she dropped
And so she
back.
got into the
needed you, Lynn.
second rate, you know, the kids' table, and so she didn't get the kind of attention that she got for the one or two times that she was that she was on the main stage. And I think she was probably the toughest person, the toughest candidate up there who stood up to him. So they had a tough decision to make. You go up against this guy, he's too good. I mean, he'll just devour you and destroy you. Because he's willing to do things that nobody else is willing to do. And they're not willing to come back at him. And if they do, he'll one-up them, and they'll be, splattered on the floor. So and I've been in this situation as a politician, is, you don't want to take the bait and get into the gutter, because when you get into the gutter with a pig, you're going to get smeared with the mud just like he is.
And I think
but he's
that
got the home field advantage.
We all thought the odds were on, he's gonna self-annihilate. He is gonna do or say something, or some Access Hollywood tape is gonna come out that causes his support to plunge.
I want to try to say one more time that the Trump victory, in my view, is not a media phenomenon. All of the things that people just talked about, the failures, were candidate failures. His opponents failing to make strategic choices that generated more news coverage for them. The reason that, he's got the home field advantage in this pig fight is because he's in a crowded field of 17 people. He identifies a large chunk of Republican primary voters who agree with him on a set of issues that are tied to race, ethnicity, identity, immigration, religion, and they are out of step with the rest of the party elite. It's not magic. It's not the news coverage. It is his positions, the things he was saying in a crowded field where the elites didn't coordinate to endorse anyone, and he is speaking to 25% of the party who's really different from those other elites.
Lynn, I would say that when asked, did the media do a good job, I don't think overall the media did do a good job. But I agree with you. I don't think it's the media's fault for the outcome. I just think they still didn't do a good job. And as I said, I think no matter what he said, do words matter? That's what this symposium is about, right? Do words matter? Well, evidently they don't to a lot of people. I don't know what else. I mean, they matter to me, and I think they matter to the audience, and they matter to many people. But not enough people cared about the language that was being used, the messaging that was being sent. I think it was Zev.
They just agreed with it.
No, I was going to say, Zev said he was transparent. He was, and he won. And that's what's tough for some, I think.
His words mattered.
And
to a lot of
his words
people.
did matter to the people who
people.
responded to him, and there were a lot of people, especially in the
Yeah.
Republican primary, who did respond to him. And I agree with you completely that it wasn't the media's fault that he won. It may be the media's fault that he got catapulted as quickly as he did, but I think if he hadn't had twice as much free media as Hillary in the general, and God knows how much more than he had free media compared to the other 16 candidates, that he still would have catapulted to the top of the list in that primary because of what he was saying. Which gets to the other thing, which is not so much media related, which is something that all of us also need to understand, and I've been harping on this since the election to my friends on my side of the aisle. Unless we understand why people did respond to him, not everybody who voted for him was a bigot or anti-Muslim, or there were people who had real anxieties. We've seen that across the country, economic anxieties, insecurities that manifested themselves in anger, and the system is broken. And I was at an event a few weeks ago with Sherrod Brown, the senator from Ohio, and I asked him, I said, what's your plan to win your campaign in a state that Hillary lost by 8 or 9 points? And he said, I spent a lot of time in small town Ohio. And he said, unless Democrats, and this is not a partisan thing, but it's just an analytical thing, unless Democrats learn how to talk to small town America, they'll win the next election by 6 million votes in the popular vote, and they'll lose the Electoral College. Because of the polarization, that's exactly what's going to happen. And so I think we all missed, and I think to some degree the media missed, and the media and the press, and certainly I'll speak for myself, I missed the extent of which the disaffection in Rust Belt America and the Ohio River Valley and all these states. I saw it coming in late 2015 more because of the ascendancy of Bernie Sanders than because of what was happening to Trump. And it turned out not to compare them in any way, shape, or form, except in the appeal they had to people who had a high anxiety level. They were two sides of the same political coin in that regard, only in that regard. And so you look at Macomb County, I keep harping on that little, I don't know how little it is, a suburb of Detroit where Reagan Democrats were invented. In the primary in Michigan, Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump commanded the lion's share of the vote in those two things, in in that county. And in the general election, that county, which Obama won by 9 and 10 points respectively, Trump won by 17 points. That's a 27-point shift. That is we've got to understand why those people flipped. What was it? And there's no one simple answer, but there's a lot written about this now, and I'm sure you're coming across it. We've got to understand what's going on here, or we're going to miss the boat.
Melissa,
one
do
more time.
journalists have the tools or skills to have done a better job telling that story in real time?
Yeah, I think they did. I mean, obviously, a lot of newsrooms have lost great numbers of people, and so it makes it tougher to go out and cover these stories. But to Zev's point, I grew up in Ohio. I just spent 5 months teaching at the University of Montana, where Gianforte tried his little trick. I got out of town in time, I guess. And I can tell you that there were a lot of cultural issues that were going on that so-called mainstream media were not really paying attention to. And again, having grown up in Ohio, knowing a lot of people who supported Trump and the reasons that they supported Trump, and it wasn't always economic in nature. Oftentimes it was a cultural thing. They felt, I think, that Donald Trump was a candidate somehow, I don't know how, but that they could relate to. He's a billionaire. But they could relate to him. Perhaps it's the American dream dialogue that people felt drawn to. I think we've tried to catch up in the time since he was elected, but I do think a lot of media outlets were caught flat-footed.
How would you have gone about reporting those stories? I mean, like, what's the counterfactual in terms of like what coverage looked like last year that had gotten that?
There were stories by the larger media outlets, but not everybody has access to those outlets or seeks out those outlets, right? So you're talking about a certain type of person who might go online and read those news sources and understand what's going on. I think there was a downplaying of, I think it was maybe Laura who said, when he would have these massive rallies, and then it just kind of became almost like a joke. These things were huge. He was going around getting 45, 50,000 people. So it was clear. I also think there's an over-reliance on polling data by media outlets, and so we kind of use that as a crutch. We look at the polling data. The New York Times says, Hillary Clinton's going to win. The number's as high as 84%, instead of looking at the way that the dynamics have changed in the particular contest. So I would have tried to focus more on state-by-state reporting and less on, the popular vote. Who cares? The popular vote is meaningless, even though we talk about it all the time.
I think another, and I've seen more and more reporting around this, and I think it's interesting, but I don't think there was a beat around social media or fake news. Still don't think there was probably a beat around fake news.
And I don't think that term was used
No.
before the election
Right.
in
But
any
the
way.
undercurrents of what was being shared on social media, which you could look at in trends and you could look at, you could analyze, were not being reported in a major way. I did see some reporting around it, but to report on it in the same way that other, I don't know, newsy items would report on, so that we understood what people were receiving in those areas in terms of the inputs, that might have helped us understand the public and maybe even the media a little bit more about what the public was absorbing in terms of information. And I think that is starting to change, but it's like we're in a new world and we're still sort of using old world thinking, and so it hasn't quite caught up to itself.
It does seem like this year, more so than probably any campaign back to 84, the assumption that one candidate was going to win seemed more heavily built into almost every bit of coverage, certainly from the conventions onward, and probably from the day that each of them secured the nomination. I think almost every story, and I have my byline on a few of them that don't look that good in hindsight, were written around often with the very clearly made assertion that Hillary Clinton is going to win. Will she win in a landslide? Will it be close? Whatever. Does it matter that was built into coverage throughout the year? Is that something we should be upset about?
I think I went back and tried to look at turnout levels, and you certainly saw lower turnout levels among African Americans, lower turnout levels than were anticipated among Latinos, and I think the polling models just didn't reflect who came to the polls. Youth vote was not as high as it had been for the first Obama, but sort of comparable to the second Obama election. What we didn't understand was the disenfranchisement efforts that were happening, or
The legal.
both legal, both the voter suppression efforts that were happening in states, but also the information that was going out that we've now come to understand a little bit better from the Trump campaign and others to turn off African Americans, turn off young women, turn off young people from voting for Hillary. So I think what was underlying that actually was a much greater disenfranchisement effort that we weren't paying attention to. So that might have affected the horse race conversation if we really knew that there were millions of dollars being spent on social media that was aimed at turning off African Americans from voting for her.
Lynn, do we know if there was more or less, horse race coverage compared to issue coverage or coverage of the candidates' records than there had been in the past?
I don't know those numbers for sure, but in the 1980s, this was a very big deal, that the media was too focused on the horse race, who's winning, who's losing, and did not talk about what the candidates' positions were on issues, did not play their positions in their own voices. Now, given where we've come, and I'm all for social science and analytics and news, the marriage of those two things. But I do think that the rise of poll aggregating and the popular attention that it's getting has to mean that the balance of horse race coverage to substantive coverage in, not in 24-hour news places, but in places with limited news holes, has got to be really imbalanced now toward horse race coverage.
Even though the assumption that there wasn't really a horse race, the competition between Trump and Clinton was a dominant story, but were people actually treating it as a horse race if there was an assumption that she was going to win and comfortably?
Oh, I think so.
Okay.
I mean, the reason that everybody wakes up in the morning and goes to check 538 or the Upshot or whatever aggregation model you like is because in some sense people are worried that it isn't going to happen. Their side's not going to win. So I do think that's why people are interested in those odds.
There was a moment in the campaign, about 2 weeks, maybe a little over 2 weeks before the election in November, Ed Rendell was being interviewed on MSNBC, and they asked him how the election was going in Pennsylvania, and he said he was very concerned. And at the moment, I thought, oh, that's just a line trying to motivate the base to show up and not take it for granted. But as the interview went on, I realized he was really damn concerned. And I just filed that away in the back of my head. And then when the election night came in, as the polls began to close in Pennsylvania, I said, Rendell knew something. And he the turnout in Philadelphia and the turnout in other parts of Pennsylvania, rural Pennsylvania, the two. And the other thing I just want to come back to is, in all the research that's going to be done and has been done, is a look at the white working class voters that flipped. White working class people who voted for Obama in 2008 and 12, who then voted for Trump. I'd really be interested in knowing exactly, I'd like to interview 100 of them and find out exactly what was going through their head. I think you've seen some of it in some of the panel discussions that have been on cable news. There was one, and I'll just be very succinct and stop. Bernie Sanders was in Wisconsin with one of the networks, and they were interviewing a panel of Democrats who voted for Trump in Wisconsin. And I remember Bernie Sanders conducting the interview with this one guy. He says, well, you're a union member, aren't you? He says, yeah, I'm a union member. He says, and you know that Trump wants to cut the unions off at the knees. Yeah, I do. And you know he wants to cut Medicare and Medicaid. He says, yeah, I do. And you want Medicaid and Medicare? Yes, I sure do. He says, so why'd you vote for Trump? And he said, because he wasn't Hillary. And it was just...
I'm glad you brought that up, Zev, because I think something else that we did not do a good job of covering was some inherent sexism in this election. People are very nervous for some reason about discussing that. Some people simply did not like her as a candidate, so I don't want to paint the brush for everybody. But I think sexism, I don't think America, frankly, was ready for a female president. And I'm not sure that we covered that very well in the media, because I think, for the most part, most people in the media would consider themselves feminists. Your mind is coming at it from a very different perspective than a lot of other people. and the people who voted simply did not want her.
What does media coverage look like if people aren't being honest with pollsters, with their neighbors, about their reasons for not supporting Hillary Clinton, or the reasons for being ambivalent about
Well,
supporting her?
they look like what they ended up looking like, which is everybody in America thought Hillary Clinton was going to be president, and people were not, I guess, honest in their responses, and she's not president. So I guess what I'm saying is, yes, there were stories. You know, is she ready? I'm not sure if "is she ready" is really getting to the heart of true sexism. To me, that doesn't really play out completely. I want a harder look at that topic.
So we've got some panel data of people we interviewed in 2011 for the first time, 8,000 of them, that we re-interview in 2015 and 16. And so we can do some of these transitions that Zev is talking about and get at some of these attitudes about gendered roles. And so the white non-college educated voters in our set of 8,000, which is how I define the white working class, about 22% of those of white non-college educated who voted for Barack Obama in 2012 switched and voted for Trump in 2016. And that is compared to about 8% of the electorate as a whole. So it's much more pronounced in that set. So about a quarter of those Obama voters switched to vote for Trump. And when we try to deconstruct that to say what's driving those changes, it is not economic anxiety, it's not trade, it is attitudes about immigration. So things like, and I don't mean, some of them are positional, should there be a pathway to citizenship, or should undocumented citizens be arrested and immediately deported, but other questions like, are immigrants mostly a contribution or a drain on society? So just your affect toward immigrants. And those things will do more work in predicting the shifts from Obama to Trump than any other issue, position, or affect that we have measures of.
And that was his principal.
And that's what
opening
he's
salvo.
talking about. And then we do have a set of questions called the modern sexism scale. Things like, women are more of a problem in the workplace than, blah, blah, blah. And we can't get traction on those. So even people saying like, oh, I'm not ready for a woman president, or in experiments when if it's a well-qualified, it's a man.
Well, they
and a
wouldn't say it
woman.
exactly that way. That's my point.
No, I know. So
Right.
we have this battery of other
Yeah.
questions that psychologists and sociologists have put together to measure this latent sexism. And we're still hammering away at this. It changes survey, data set to data set, but there's no overwhelming evidence of this latent sexism that we've been able to find so far.
So for all of you, in whatever order, journalists or the media are the only useful institutional check on Trump, and there definitely is a sense that, New York Times, Washington Post in particular, on a seemingly daily basis have major scoops that are often contributing to investigative drive or public or political appetite or willingness to support investigations into the administration. A lot of it, though, is stuff that theoretically could have been reported before November 8th, stuff about Michael Flynn's ties to foreign governments for whom he did work, stuff about Trump family business ties to various Russians. A large part of the web of what is coming out on a daily basis is stuff that theoretically could have been covered, unearthed, stitched together, contextualized before November. So while we're lionizing what press coverage is doing to hold the administration accountable in 2017, do any of you feel like that represents to some degree a failure of press coverage in 2016 or 2015 to make this knowledge about the milieu in which Trump and his people operated known to the electorate?
I'll take that one first. Theoretically, I would say that's a tough call. And it's a tough call because we don't know who their sources are for all of this material. And it could be that people came forward to share the material only after the election and not before the election. So could they have found it? Perhaps. But I don't think you can put that sort of expectation necessarily that they would have, because they're getting it from somebody else. Someone has to leak that stuff in order for it to be brought forward. So I would say, I don't think it was a complete failure of coverage that got him elected. I think he got elected for the reasons that Lynn says he got elected. The American public wanted him to be president.
I do see a shift in the way reporters, at least in their Twitter feeds, maybe not necessarily in their coverage, and I'm talking most about print reporters here, have shifted their attitude about what he says and tweets, and what they're hearing. And so there seems to, so when revelation after revelation of Russia engagement or conversations that were never reported on come out, I think there seems to be a shift for reporters to be skeptical, maybe more, in about pretty much anything that's coming out of the Trump administration, and that has shifted the tone of coverage and the volume of coverage in a different way. And maybe if that had existed before, I don't know, because I think there's also, which we haven't talked about, and maybe people will later today, this idea of when you have a strong set of beliefs, how facts reinforce or don't reinforce that. And I do believe that the media represents a key role in driving facts, but the question of how people absorb those facts is different. I don't ever want to see the news media go away from this conversation, and I'm grateful for them every day. Whether or not people that we want to hear those facts are hearing them is another piece of it.
Zev, so, I mean, part of what in the last few minutes seems to have come up here is kind of a removal of giving the benefit of the doubt to Trump. That reporters now, I think, are defaulting to the assumption that what he says might not be honest or truthful or complete, which is, I think, a shift of the, even journalists who are naturally skeptical or curious don't default to the assumption that somebody in a position of power, whether it's the president or the press secretary, is more likely than not to be lying, which I think we have reasonable grounds on which to assume that now. And I think that one of the other sort of benefits of the doubt gets to what Lynn was talking about and what sort of Melissa proffered, which is that voters' motives are not driven by racism or ethnic animus or to the extent that the immigration lines up with those or noxious gender attitudes. And I think that to some degree the joke about everything's economic anxiety as, you know, as sort of the cover for its racism or xenophobia or whatever it may be is a way of giving the benefit of the doubt to voters. Is Trump so anomalous that we should take these things and say, yeah, we should cover Trump more cynically, and that's that? Or should this be the default of journalists covering anybody who's running for public office or holding public office, that we should assume that they are probably lying, we should assume that they are hiding, you know, potentially treacherous motives for doing their jobs, we should assume that every voter might be motivated by really base motivations that we think are you know, pre-modern in our politics? Where does that stop?
I don't think you need to cover him cynically or I just think cover him. What did Truman once say about the Congress, you know, or about the Republicans? He says, "Give them hell, Harry." He says, I'm not giving them hell, but
Telling the
I'm
truth
telling
and
the
they think
truth,
it's
and
hell.
they think it's hell. This guy lies in his own words. Just last week, 3 different times he had 3 different stories. In the Lester Holt interview, then the retraction of the Lester Holt interview, then he doubled down on it a day later. So you're covering, look, the problem he's got, and he's only been around there 130 days or whatever, it's, as Gary eloquently said, it seems like forever. It takes time for all this stuff to settle in, and with the American people. Even remember, when Nixon resigned, a big chunk of the overwhelming majority of the Republicans in this country were still with him. Not in the United States Senate, but in the public. So he's going to have his base, and he's fighting to keep his base now, because the only sword he has over the Republicans in Congress is the threat that he could primary them with a Trump guy. The minute he loses his cachet with the Republican base, he doesn't have that anymore. That's a third leg of his stool: the judiciary, the free press, and keeping the Republicans in check. But I think he's got his biggest problem over time is going to be what Lyndon Johnson's problem was, a credibility gap. And his credibility gap, Trump's credibility gap, is much more immediate and much more transparent than Johnson's was at the same point in his presidency. This guy has a truth problem, has a veracity problem. And it will come into play, not over this issue or that issue, you know, some trivial secondary issue. It'll come to play when he decides he wants to go to war, or he wants to do something that puts my sons or grandsons and your sons and grandsons at some risk. When he wants to mobilize the country behind a very an action, an escapade of which the public is skeptical as to its legitimacy. That's the worst. I mean, that I say not as a Democrat criticizing a Republican. That I say as an American, because when the chips are down and you got to move on something, you've got to have, your leader's got to have enough credibility that the people will follow him. The difference between being a leader and a loner is a very thin line, and he's hovering over it at this point in time.
Well, it's my time to lead.
Okay.
So I have to thank Laura, Zev, Lynn, and Melissa for joining us, and thank all of you.
It's very easy to draw very strong partisan lines in the current environment, but in fact, there must be a great many Republican-identified either members of the Trump administration, elected officials, or otherwise, who are actually working very hard to resist, because that's where the leaks come from. There are no leaks coming from, there are no Democrats there, so that's not how that's happening. But there's also the role of geography, being in the White House. The day that Comey was fired, BuzzFeed reporter Adrian Carrasquillo overheard the three leading spokespeople for the administration go lock themselves in a room and start screaming at one another. He reported it, and then that actually became part of the story about the fact that no one had been notified that this was going to happen. And so I want to get a sense from you. Do you think that the geographic proximity to leaks, to the White House, to what's going on inside the building matter? And what role do you think online outlets have to play in making this a more effective press environment?
Yeah, I'm of two minds on this, because there have been some reports that are the results of leaks that actually are wildly consequential. The Russian meeting, I think, is an example of one of those where, because of the leak, we found out something that is actually very important. Things like overhearing screaming in the White House, to me, is very interesting and is funny, and fits into my own idea of what working in the White House must be like right now. I don't think it's particularly significant to most people outside of the Beltway, and I'm not sure if I qualify as a Beltway elite, but there are things that I think people assume Beltway elites care about that even I truly do not care about and are not significant. I think maybe one of the problems or risks of being so close to the White House is that things that I find fascinating, like palace intrigue, don't actually affect the material conditions of most people's lives. And I think a lot of reporting and talking about the White House specifically can get so caught up in the palace intrigue that for most Americans, it sounds like background noise, or it sounds silly or sounds petty, regardless of whether or not you think it's petty, and can distract from explaining in kind of concrete terms, why does the screaming matter? Why is that significant? Is the yelling, is the fact that Spicer's maybe about to get fired more important than what's happening to Medicaid? And so it goes both ways. It depends what the leak is about. But I think there is a risk with being so DC sometimes, or so New York, that we fail to remember that most people just truly do not care about who is screaming, and probably imagine that that kind of screaming happens all the time, even when it's not leaked on Twitter.
So in many of the times that I've ever spoken to you about something going down in Washington, Pilar, you've always been relatively disinterested in palace intrigue. And
Yes.
you've been way more interested into how this affects the reader community that are likely to hear or to read what you've written. And I want to ask if you think in the current environment it's still possible, it's still a worthwhile undertaking to sort of look at the events from the individual point of view, or do you feel like you're being drowned out by the circus environment of the entire circumstance?
We drown out mean the Spanish language media or?
Well, I was thinking that reporters focusing on the real-world impact of policies being proposed are being overshadowed by the coverage of the outrage and coverage of the intrigue.
So working for a Spanish language media, newspaper in this case, or we have online presence, of course, we've always lived in kind of a different universe than the mainstream media. We have a very different audience in some ways. First of all, because they speak Spanish and many of them are immigrants. And if they're not immigrants, if they come to us, it's to look for certain specific information. We all know that this particular White House is very focused on immigration issues and on what happens to a large part of the audience that we cater to. So even though we do have a DC correspondent and we cover some of the most significant stories, especially those that impact people directly, for example, the budget cuts are one of them, and all the different policy, all the different executive orders that had to do with issues that we care about, we really don't cover those palace intrigues that you were talking about so much. People are interested to a certain extent. Latinos, like everyone else, are citizens of this country, and they want to know what's going on, and they're as fascinated by Trump in very different ways. But people come to us for a specific view, for a specific point of view on how these different policies are affecting our audience, right? So that's our specialty. That's what we cater to. So we usually do not follow the same script that the mainstream media follows. So sometimes, mainstream media will be, and by talking about mainstream media, it's a very broad brush. I don't like to use it because there's very different types of mainstream media. People tend to put media in one pot when media is very different from each other. But people, for example, when there's an attack like the Manchester attack, tend to be consumed 100%. Like television doesn't do anything else other than inform on this. We don't necessarily do that. We don't necessarily follow the same script. We do inform about it, but it's not our main focus. Our main focus continues to be the person that was deported next door. So I think our point of view is kind of different.
So I'm going to turn to our friends from the Los Angeles Times and ask a variety of questions. The LA Times weighed in a really strong way on the current administration. And first, the question I have for both of you, and I'd like to hear different perspectives, is what is it that you think the LA Times hopes to accomplish with such a strong statement so early in the administration? And second, does it feel a little odd being here on the West Coast? I feel often in Los Angeles that we're so removed from the Beltway conversations, et cetera. So I'd like to hear both of you talk about both of those and really the overall giant marker that the LA Times laid down against the current administration.
Well, we ran this big 6-part editorial series. We got millions of views. People saw it all over the place, and we got lots of comments, and many of the comments were positive, and many of them were really viciously negative. But the negative comment that most stood out to me, or the group of negative comments that most stood out to me, were the ones that said, why are you doing this so early? Why are you doing it so soon? You haven't given the president a chance. You've declared him to be a liar and a lunatic and a conspiracy theorist and a failure, and he hasn't even reached the first 100 days. And I kind of took that to heart. But our thinking was, this man is not new to us. We've known him for many, many years. We've been following him very closely for the last year and a half or two of the campaign. We were among the earliest papers to write, back in the early days of the Republican primaries, that Trump was unfit, unsuited, and unqualified for the job. We were, again, we kept writing about him day after day. We were harshly critical of him when we endorsed Hillary Clinton. So then the election rolled around, and there was this little bit of us that hoped, well, maybe it was all a big show. Maybe he would change. Maybe he would be, feel the enormity of the responsibility on his shoulders and become more mature. And we watched him and we wrote about him day after day in these one-off editorials. We don't like this cabinet appointment. We don't like this executive order. This tweet was irresponsible. And after a while, we said, no, we have to lay down a marker here for what we think of Donald Trump. And this is not our final say on him. This is a baseline. He may change. He may grow. He may shrink. But we're going to try to pull it all together for our readers and say what it is we think. And our verdict was very harsh, but there was no, I have an editorial board of 9 people. No one disagreed. I have a publisher. He didn't disagree. And the vast majority of our readers didn't disagree either. I think I think it was early. I think it was sort of strongly spoken, but I think it was the right thing to do.
Yeah, I think it was the right thing to do. I was very heartened by what the Times did. Because I think like Nick just said, what it did was kind of took all these discrete facts that have been come out every day, every minute about Trump and kind of told us, here's what it means. Here's who he is, based on the facts. And I think it's really easy to just get so focused on the outrageous stuff. They all kind of have equal weight. The outrageous, you really lose track. I was telling Pilar, I can't connect the dots anymore. And I just have to be reminded in a really clear way about the truth. Their facts are the truth. That's a whole other discussion. But the truth is that this guy's a disaster. And I have to say, I grew up in the Watergate era. I was a teenager in the 70s, and I grew up with the idea, just the idea, that the press, held people's feet to the fire. That's what I thought journalism was. I never thought it was anything else. I didn't know the whole history of journalism, which might have been a good thing. And also, when I started writing for the Times in 1992, which is, this 25th year of the civil unrest in LA, there's a long history of people not trusting the media. I'm sure you know this. Not out and out lies, but a history of not trusting the media. And when I say that, I mean, I grew up in South Central, and black people didn't trust the media. Not that they thought it lied. They thought it didn't put things together. It didn't emphasize the right things. It left people out. Because, they think that the media, the mainstream media, for lack of a better term, frames the narrative of the country. What's important, what's not, who's important, who's not. So when I went to work for the Times, people said, oh, now you're writing for the LA Crimes. That was their favorite line. And so I know what that meant. I know what that meant. But yet I had this faith in I really, I said, well, I'm going to do the right thing. I'm going to be fair and balanced, but I'm going to tell the truth, which means I'm going to, write what I see. And so I think now, though, what's happening now, just these out and out lies, and to me, is something different. It's something, and I didn't mean to get so philosophical so early, but it seems to me that people are panicking over not being able to face the truth. And they want to believe what they believe, and that is it. Because there's the stakes of facing, the complicated truth about this country, which is not very pretty, which is what James Baldwin talked about for a long time. The stakes are higher and higher, and people just want to stay in their sort of truth silos. And I thought that was impossible. I thought, well, at some point you have to come out of that silo and say, okay, this is what's happening. But that's not happening. And to the detriment of everybody. I feel, even though I grew up with a real kind of a cynicism about this country, my relatives grew up in Jim Crow and all that, certain cynicism there that many people have. I was shocked by this election. I felt a faith, a betrayal that I didn't know I could experience. I guess that's kind of a good thing. But anyway, I feel like, so I was very, getting back to your question, very happy to see what the Times has done, and other people are, I think, giving people courage. And the media has a very big job before it now. The media is now part of the 99% of trampled upon people. They are now, in the ghetto. So what are they going to do? How are they going to respond? Being frozen out. I don't know if we're gonna get better coverage as, or not. I don't know. But it's a very critical question.
Can I just take a very quick shot at the second half of your question? Just to say, I love covering national politics from the West Coast. It's, you know, I was a reporter on the East Coast for many years. I've been a Washington reporter. I've been a campaign reporter. I know what it's like to be in that bubble. I know exactly what Adam is talking about when he talks about, you know, just sort of, or when he hinted at just kind of sitting there waiting for the briefers to come out and tell you what you're going to write and acting as a stenographer. It's very different to be in California. I'm an East Coaster by birth, and I like being in a place where we think about different issues, whether it's immigration, whether it's the environment, and we think about issues in a different way, and we feel far away from that bubble. And I think that's a useful thing, a fun thing, and I don't think, you know, if you're a news reporter, you'd want to be, you know, if you're a news reporter covering the Trump administration, then you want to be close to it, and you want to be able to go out for drinks with the people in the administration. When you do the kind of stuff that I do on the opinion side, when you're sort of pulling things together and writing editorials or editing op-ed pieces, I think it's really good to be far away from Washington. I think it's in some ways destructive and corrupting, not to be too strong, to be in that bubble.
So I'm going to follow up with Aaron and with Pilar and say, is it your sense, what sort of grade would you give the media in general, and particularly the highest visibility outlets, for covering the current circumstances from the perspective of women, from the perspective of people of color? In your view, are they doing an A job, a C job, or are in some instances those concerns being entirely written out of the narrative? I'll start with Pilar.
I'm in trouble.
If I don't get you in trouble, I'm not.
I have a lot of respect for some of the mainstream media, but I think the fact that we've gotten where we have, and I'm talking about issues like immigration, for example, that became the catalyst for this campaign, for this administration to become, you know, to be in the White House. It's because of the lack of adequate coverage of this issue for many years. We, you know, when I say we, you know, La Opinión, Univision, Telemundo, other smaller newspapers, other Spanish language media, some people say we cover immigration too much. That is probably true. But this has been a crisis in this country for a long, long time. The policy of this country towards immigration it doesn't deal with reality. It doesn't even deal with the economic reality of the country. It's just led by the extremes, by the minimum, you know, by the people who are screaming especially on one side, the anti-immigrant side. And there's not been enough of coverage of the impact, the real impact of policies that started in the 90s with Bill Clinton all the way until now. And the fact that this current president was able to use those issues in the way that he did to become president of the United States, when, you know, he opened his presidency by insulting our neighbor to the south and all Mexicans in general and all Latin Americans. I'm not Mexican, but I consider myself part of that same community. It's a testament to that. And still today, I think there's not enough. There's more the diversity in newsrooms now. I think that has a lot to do with it. The lack of diversity, the lack of Latinos. We don't have Latinos in the Sunday news shows, for example. We don't have a lot of Latinos in national media. She can talk about other minorities, but in the case of Latinos, I don't see ourselves. Still, we are not represented, and I think that has allowed this issue to become kind of schizophrenic. On the one side, when you take polls, people are against the wall. I'm talking about Americans in general, not just Latinos. People are against the wall. People are against massive deportations, and yet we are here where we are, where the president has proposed cutting all of these social programs to pay for the wall, and where every day we are covering, heartbreaking family separations, people who've been here for years, who are being pulled away from their families and deported in the most horrible way. And the immigration system in this country is so removed from the regular justice system. The immigration courts are not even part of the judicial system. They're part of the Department of Justice under Jeff Sessions, You know what that means. So it's really hard to be covering these issues. Still, after 20 years, we're still in this place, and I think that's part of it. It's the failure of the mainstream media to cover this issue adequately.
Aaron?
Yeah, I think, number one, the media's having a understandably hard time keeping up. I just think it's just hard, because before this panel, I was talking to Nick and Pilar, like, refresh my memory, what happened last week, and all major stuff. And so I think, number one, that's been hard for the media to keep up. And what's happened in the last 10 to 15 years, is media itself has shrunk. The traditional newspaper reporting, which we all still rely on, despite the proliferation of the internet and sites and stuff, there's a core kind of reporting that has to be done that we have less of, I think. And we have, as Pilar said, we have less ranks of people of color. That means something. But I think all these issues, you talk about the impact on women, Latino people, black people, you name it. Any justice movement of the last, 40 years is in trouble. And we're not, even like climate change, which is huge, and actually worries me most. I mean, if I had to rank everything, that worries me most, is not getting the proper coverage. But I was just thinking how disheartening it is. Before, 100 years ago, before this election, we were making some headway on important things. We were having discussions about Black Lives Matter and white privilege. People were getting comfortable with the idea that this is a complicated country. And, I felt a little optimistic. Obama was not the perfect president. And then we all get, body slammed. This avalanche of crap comes on our head. And we're just trying to get our heads above the rubble. And so to follow narratives, about the impact of certain policies on various groups, Trump's not interested in these groups. I don't think it's just a group of one. That's it. I mean, I don't see any constituency that he's got. I really do not. If somebody has an idea, please tell me. Maybe with the exception of his family. So I think that's part of the reason why we're not getting, you're not following any particular group. Immigrants, sure, that's a big group though. Immigrants of all colors, of all, Muslims have been intense focus, and Latinos too. But I just think that, so much of this ugliness unfortunately, it's in our policies of, going back hundreds of years. It's something that, we're kind of used to. I hate to say it, but we're kind of used to it. I'm starting to have this philosophical argument with people, strangers on the street. What is America really? Is it really an ugly country? Is it a bunch of ugly attitudes with this thin veneer of democratic ideals? And the ugliness is winning out right now. And so I think it really gets down to that. And the media coverage just reflects that. But I think also the media is really just scrambling to keep up. This is really unprecedented in terms of things happening, and and every day, stuff that's so consequential. It's a really hard challenge. So I'm cutting the media more slack than I normally cut it.
Under the circumstances,
Under
that's
the
allowed. Yeah.
circumstances.
I'm gonna turn now to Carlos, and one of the original ideas that Mark Peterson and I had when we first started talking about this was that, from the perspective of policymakers, facts, knowing what is and what is not in the society is super important to knowing how to fix it or how to craft good public policy around it. Vox is part of a new form of journalism. I see it as an outlet in the smart journalism, information journalism kind of space. I wonder if you have a sense of whether or not being online, being smart journalism, really driven by facts, by data, by that level of detail, if the current environment is the perfect environment for the type of work that you guys do to grow, or is it the worst environment for the type of work that you are your ideas more important because they're evidentially based, or are your ideas less important because the administration's not paying attention?
First of all, thank you for calling us smart journalism. It's always nice to hear. We don't refer to ourselves
That's not to
that way.
suggest that the rest of journalism is dumb journalism.
Sure. I think what makes Vox's approach different is that though we do care a whole bunch about facts and stats, our MO, or what motivates how we work, is how do you explain that to a layperson in a way that's meaningful? So this news environment has been good for us, or we're trained to deal with it because a bunch happens in a week, and then we have to write a piece that's not, here's all the stuff that happened this week, but here's the stuff that happened this week that matters, here's why, here's the very least you need to know about it to be reasonably well informed, go live the rest of your life. And that's an important middle ground. I think one of the failures of traditional journalism that Vox tried to respond to is this idea that our job is merely to be stenographers of information and not providers of knowledge or wisdom. And something that we try to do is present what both sides of an argument are, and then present our best judgment for which side is right, why they're right, and why you should care about that and how that should impact you. I think one of the things that Vox prides itself on that does work for this environment is there's a bunch of resources in the video department, and I work on the video team. And I think one of the things that's missing, I think one of the reasons that the anti-media critique is so effective is that it's easy to imagine the media as being this soulless, heartless thing, an East Coast thing, these monstrous, childless people who just go into work to write hit pieces and Word documents and then go home. And then it's very easy to caricature and attack that version of the media. I don't like that version of the media. One of the things that video does so well that I think we can sort of all learn from is it shows you a person, or at least a voice you have to look at and listen to. And I think that humans are really bad at being jerks to other humans. It's like tougher to be a jerk when you can hear someone's voice or see someone's face. So for the videos I do, for example, I like try to be funny and make jokes and be warm and empathetic and talk about who I am as a person, not because it changes the factual basis of my argument, but because I think people's natural distrust of new or especially conflicting sources of information is tampered down a bit when you say, by the way, I'm a person, and here are like my weird insecurities about myself on camera, and also here's a weird joke about me from when I was in college. It like calms the person down a lot. Humans have a very tough time processing new information that doesn't fit in with the world they already think. And if you do it in a way that's funny and warm and approachable and shows you like, by the way, this is just a job, I have to go home and take out the trash later, I have kids who drive me crazy, like that lowers that distrust. And I think a lot of what is scary about the attack on the media can be dispelled, or at least triaged in some way, by combining the facts and hard reporting you're doing with this like softness that comes with being a human, and saying, I write about this because I'm scared. I write about this because I have a bunch of really close friends who are undocumented, or I write about this because I want to have a kid someday, and so maternity care means a lot to me. Something about that like very base, relatable aspect of being a human translates well to video, but I think that element of I'm a reporter, but I'm also just a dude who like is doing this for work because I don't want the world to burn is very important in terms of like lowering the level of animosity or natural distrust that humans just psychologically have when they're faced with a story that doesn't already filter into their established worldview beforehand.
So Adam, the New York Times was the original smart journalism, and everyone for much of my life have considered the New York Times to be the paper of record. I want to explore that with you in two ways. The first is, I wonder if you have any insight on the relationship between the president and the Times. He spends a lot of time denigrating the New York Times, and in so doing makes it clear that he digests everything that's in that paper every day. Which is interesting because reading's not his favorite subject. And so I wonder if you have a sense about the role of the Times in the current environment. And then after that, I'd like you to sort of give me a 30,000-foot view about the role of the Times and the Washington Post, perhaps the New Yorker, Atlantic, kind of the heritage media properties and whether or not they have a particular responsibility or role in the current environment.
So to the first question about Trump and the Times, I think what you need to remember about Trump is that he's from New York City, and he's part of the New York City tabloid newspaper culture. And I don't want to get into psychoanalyzing him because that's a little scary, but I think that he needs the kind of approval from the Times that you discover a lot of public officials in New York, at least, and I would say in Washington do. And I just don't think he's ever lost that. The fact is, as you recall, right after the election day, he's trashing New York Times day after day, and then he was supposed to come in to see the Times editorial board, and at the last minute he refused because he was upset about something. But then he came, right? He came to the editorial board and he met with reporters for an hour and a half. I just think he needs the Times, someone like him just sort of needs the approval that comes with the Times. That's the first part of it. The second part of it is, as somebody who really comes out of a salesman kind of culture, not a political culture, he realizes that the Times is a really good way to get your sort of case across. And I think that he's very aware of that and tries to take advantage of that. So it's a combination of being the salesman, needing the kind of approval, it's sort of being part of this culture. Remember, he's from Queens. I mean, I think everything about this sort of makes sense to him. And I think that he feels, again, without playing Gail Sheehy, psychologist here, right? I think he feels a little bit violated at the Times, along with a lot of the other media, has been so, in my opinion, tough on him. I think fairly so, but has been. I think he's shocked that he's not getting these sort of approving kind of stories from the Times. One of the things that struck me about when he came into the Times editorial board / reporter meeting, I think the date was November 7th. It's worth going back and reading it if you haven't. He talked for a long time. He talked about climate change. He talked about, everything, right? And we wrote stories about it. And I remember, Tom Friedman, who's a great columnist, wrote a story about him, about him and climate change. Now maybe there's a chance for climate change, blah, blah, blah. Not a single thing he said to us was true, or at least he never did any of the stuff he said. And that convinced me is that he's someone who very much wants to win the approval of his audience. Excuse me, I'm sorry. And that's what we saw there. So, in a weird way, I was thinking, would we want him to come back in again? I mean, I guess so, but, if he's not saying anything that he really believes that will matter a day later, what's the difference? So that's the answer to the first question. And then you can say, and I'm just continuing, there's a couple of reporters, one in particular, Maggie Haberman, Elle Magazine just wrote a profile of her. She writes some of the toughest stuff about Trump that anyone writes about, right? She's just a fantastic reporter. And he just always keeps calling her and giving her access, and people in the administration give her stuff. And I think part of that's because Maggie's such a great reporter, and part of that is because it's the New York Times. But there's always this thing, if you ever cover it, Nick can talk about this too, if you're covering a politician, whether it's, Trump's kind of not a great example because he's not a normal politician, but whether it's a Jerry Brown or a Mario Cuomo or whoever, there's always sort of this sort of dynamic of people expect you to write positive stuff about them because that'll get more access and more information. I've learned over the years, again, from Mario Cuomo, from covering Bill Clinton, David Dinkins, Rudy Giuliani, that politicians, most of all, like strength from reporters. In other words, they like to get beaten up. I'm not talking in a kinky kind of way, but that's the way they kind of respond to stuff. And I think there's probably an element of that with Trump too, right? That he sort of admires toughness from a reporter. And I think that translates into how he responds to a lot of the stuff from the New York Times. The other thing we're seeing is that for a variety of, to your other question, for a variety of reasons, most of them I think good reasons about society and journalism, and I'm a total believer in the media, the newspapers. You're seeing major media, legacy media and non-legacy media, rise to the occasion, right? You're seeing day after day, scoop after scoop from the Washington Post, the New York Times, in particular other media as well, including some electronic media. And I think part of that is that people realize that this is a really important moment, that there's more importance ever for the media to sort of step up and do investigative stuff. I've lived through many newspaper wars. I saw them with tabloids in New York in the, I forget what decade it was, 90s, maybe it was the 80s, but the Daily News and New York Post, and these are good things. I mean, one of the things that are so bad about losing media outlets in so many communities like LA, right, without having as much competition as you once had, is that you lose a sort of aggressiveness that you need to find out what's going on. But we're seeing it now like you rarely see. The other part of this, which is interesting, which is not in any way denigrate what these media organizations are doing, is that this is translated into tons of paid subscribers, right? In other words, like the fact that Trump is president now, the fact that the New York Times, the Washington Post, and other organizations are covering him so aggressively is resulting in lots and lots of revenue, right? Coming at a time when the business model for mainstream or traditional journalism is collapsing. So all this stuff is kind of feeding together and creating, I don't want to use this phrase perfect storm because I hate that cliche, but creating that PS for the media right now. And that's what I think is creating the Washington Post, New York Times thing that you're seeing, which I think is incredibly important. I think that I believe that we're having this, we were having this session in 30 years, assuming that we're all here in the California's underwater, that we'd still be talking about this. I think it's that important in terms of the history of the journalism in this country.
So early on in our discussion, Nick pointed out that the critiques that the LA Times got about its pretty comprehensive, aggressive critique of the new administration suggested that the new administration hasn't been given a chance. I haven't given my 10-year-old a chance to drive the car yet either. And she thinks that's unfair, but I say that because Der Spiegel recently published an editorial, which was, well, actually, it was not dissimilar to a condensed version of the LA Times series, but used words that we don't often use in American press.
I mean, words in German?
I'm sorry?
Words in German?
Well, the English version, but thank you for that. You just flew in from the coast, up the way my arm's tired. But what did they have to say about the president? So, Der Spiegel, a pretty widely circulated magazine in Germany, they described the president of the United States as amoral, as ignorant, as lazy, as mean-spirited, and as dangerous. And in the last, well, frankly, just in the last 3 weeks, we have reporting that the president disclosed classified material from obtained by another country's intelligence service to the Russians. The UK today stopped cooperating in terms of the disclosure of confidential and top secret information because of leaks coming out of the Trump White House. He refused to shake the Chancellor of Germany's hand. He, of course, has a storied relationship with Mexico. He's offended South Korea, Australia, Canada. At the same time, we have a proposal to put 23 million people off of their health insurance. That's admittedly more partisan. When does it become incumbent upon the American media to begin to collectively call for the resignation or impeachment of the president? And I'm interested to hear, because we have the notice that the notion that the LA Times was too early in their critique, but we're just a few weeks later and perhaps they're too late. So I'm just kind of interested to hear from the entire panel, is there a moment when the American press should just start publicly calling for the removal of the president? And if so, what are the dangers to the press, and what are the positives to the press, and what are the dangers to the society, and what are the positives to the society? And I'll start with Nick.
I think that there's no question that at an editorial board like mine, and a New York Times editorial board, and editorial boards and opinion places of opinion journalism all around the country, this is a question we have to start thinking of. Beginning, I think it was last week, when you had scoop after scoop after scoop from the Washington Post and the New York Times about the Russia investigation, about collusion, about the firing of Jim Comey. That was when the word impeachment first started to, not first started, but first seriously began to cross the lips of people. And at our paper, we began to think about exactly the question you're asking. What would it take for us to support a call for impeachment? What would it take for us to write an editorial suggesting that the president ought to resign? What would it take for us to suggest that they ought to, put the 25th Amendment into action and have the president removed? Those are things we really ought to be thinking about. They're hard questions. It seems to me that we could. It was very clear last week that we could easily, we got millions and millions of clicks for our editorial series about the president, but we could have done that again and doubled it had we been the first paper to come out and say it's time to impeach the president. But we felt that this is a really, really big, dangerous, important step. The fact of the matter is you may not like the way the election campaign was run. You may be upset that the president didn't win the popular vote, but the president won the election. To step in and undo the will of the people by impeachment, by the 25th Amendment or something else, that's an enormous, enormous step to take. It could tear the country apart. It should be done when it has to be done, but we have to think hard about what it would, what the bar is beyond which we can't stand anymore. We looked a lot last week at the meaning of obstruction of justice, right? The Comey revelations that first of all, that the firing was done under, false pretenses, that the president had asked him to drop the investigation against Flynn. Well, does that constitute a crime? Do you have to have a crime in order to impeach someone? Well, you don't. Should you? If so, does someone, would we as an editorial board and should the House of Representatives, before it impeaches someone, have in front of it enough information to make it feel that it could prosecute an obstruction of justice charge in a criminal court? These are the questions we have to address. At our editorial board, we have not yet decided it's time to call for the president to step down. We've not yet decided that it's time for him to be impeached, but we've moved to a level of DEFCON whatever that I wouldn't have expected we could possibly be at 120 or 130 days into the presidency. He's a scary president. Those words that you used from Der Spiegel, we used very, very similar words in our series. We called them dangerous, we called them paranoid, we called them narcissistic and erratic and petulant and every other negative adjective we could find in the thesaurus. It certainly could happen, but we're not there yet.
Aaron?
Oh, I think we're there. I'm speaking as a citizen, I guess, but, I can say that as an opinion columnist, but I think, I'm sitting here thinking, what happened in 73, 74? Did the papers call for Nixon's impeachment? And do you know the answer to that? Was there a immediate
don't.
call for his impeachment, for Richard Nixon's impeachment?
The hair color suggests that I would remember.
Okay. Maybe you don't. Sorry, I didn't mean
I
to
was
imply.
11, so-
Did not mean to imply. Oh, but I think that.
How about the Andrew Johnson? Were you around for that one?
Yeah, there you go. That Buchanan administration was crazy.
Yeah, I was thinking the media. I think. Yeah, when you call for an impeachment, if the paper, editorializes, the president has to go, that's sort of your final step. There's no going back, right? So it is a big step. But I worry, I think you implied, by the time we call for impeachment, it'll be too late. How much do we have to see before we make that move? And I'm not sure that would have an effect. I'm not sure what would happen after that. I'm not sure he'd actually be impeached. We have a Republican-controlled government, so I'm really much more worried about that than I am about the media. But as one writer I know, Ishmael Reed, described the media as a government in exile. So if that government, in some ways the responsibility is like politicians, they have to tell us, people do, for all the griping about them, people listen to what they have to say. It matters. And I think in the last, 20 years, or at least as long as I've been doing this, it seems to me, the media and the government have enjoyed a pretty cozy relationship a lot of times. And, they want the end. It's a little bit like Hollywood, and there's more we could go on about how media has turned into entertainment, has turned into celebrityism. We could talk about that. We haven't talked about that at all, but that's a big part of this. And so, the media's not so kind of reluctant to give up their source, their connection. So the question is, as it is for the government of this country, the elected officials, at what point do you put the country above your personal gain or your connections or your career, whatever it is? I'm beyond there, but I'm just one person, So I think it's a really important role the media has to play. And I think that we've lived in this really ridiculous ethos of fair and balanced journalism, which on the one hand is, of course, appropriate, objective reporting, looking at two sides, et cetera. But at some point, there's not two sides to something anymore. At some point, we hope the media would say, this is what this means. This is dangerous. And this is this is the truth. Rather than, go on and on about the palace intrigue, as Adam said, and about these discrete details that, just keep, we don't make into a narrative. And so I don't know when or if that'll happen. I don't know. It seems like we have to put our faith either in the media or the Republican government, and I don't have a lot of faith in either one. I have faith in various people, but as institutions, as much as I believed in the media as watchdog, kind of, watchdogging the looking out for the country's best interests, I really generally don't believe that. I think it's coming back. I think being frozen out is kind of a good thing for the media. They're realizing they have nothing to lose. They've already lost it. So that's kind of a good thing. But can they catch up? Can they kind of get up to speed in terms of how things are happening and what they mean? I don't know.
Pilar.
So from the point of view of Spanish language media, Latinos, 7 or 8, depending on which poll, 7 out of 10 or 8 out of 10 Latinos voted against Donald Trump. We're not really that divided about him from before the election. We editorialized he was unfit for the presidency before he was president. So for many of us who are immigrants to this country is a role model. Many of the countries we come from, I'm from Venezuela. You all know what's going on there. Right now, a big mess. We look up to the United States. I mean, there's a lot of controversy over, policies of the United States and Latin America, but at the same time, we do look up to the institutions. And I've been covering politics for La Opinión for a long time. And, we've had ups and downs, and this country is not perfect. But, I still always had this view, and I still do, to a certain extent, have the view of this country as a role model in many ways. I don't know how many times that, I've heard people in my in my environment say the words banana republic lately. It seems that there's a lot of stuff going on that shouldn't be going on in this country. And you wonder whether or not he is impeached or he leaves the White House now or in 4 years or more. What is it about this country? What is it about us here? And I consider myself part of us now. I'm a naturalized citizen. I've been here for 30 years. What is it about us that allowed this to happen? Will it be repeated? Is there something about our political system? Is there something about our electoral system? Maybe the electoral college needs to be abolished. It seems to me that minorities who are very extreme are ruling this country, not the bigger middle, not the people who are moderate, not the people who are inclusive and democratic-minded are the ones that are ruling. So, I have more questions than answers on this, but would definitely Spanish language media is not divided on Trump. We really want to see him go.
Carlos.
I'll separate whether or not Trump is deserving of impeachment from whether or not newspapers should call for it. I think for the second question, a couple of things. One is it's always going to be tough to call for it because when it comes to things like obstruction of justice or these kinds of investigations, information always comes out so slowly and incrementally that there's never really a thing that makes it obvious to everyone at once that someone has obstructed justice. It's a bunch of little stuff that makes you slowly go, this feels like obstruction of justice, and then you do it. So that's a concern always, is that you're never going to have a green light for a newspaper to say, clearly, impeachment. You'll always seem to some people like you're coming out too soon. I think there's also a question of what you want to do by having a newspaper call for impeachment. If your goal is to persuade Trump supporters that their president is deserving of impeachment, it's probably not going to work. That won't change their minds. I think what it can do is, there's a lot of talk about normalization now. I think in the same way that people are worried about normalizing Trump, there's a way to like normalize impeachment by like talking about it a lot. If the LA Times, the New York Times came out tomorrow and said Trump is deserving of impeachment, most people might not agree with them, but CNN would spend an entire night with 8-person panels talking about whether or not we should impeach the president. And there is something to be said about the sort of like the osmosis reinforcing effect of saying impeachment over and over again, that people who might now currently think it's a very radical act might after a while think, maybe let's impeach this person. There's a way that you frame the debate that way. I think that probably changes the behavior of politicians too. If you're a Republican and you have to go home to your town hall, if CNN has spent the whole week talking about potentially impeaching the president, you're going to get asked a question about impeachment, and then you're going to be on the record talking about it. It's just, there's like a domino effect of if everyone's talking about it, you have to talk about it. And that alters the behavior, I think, both of the White House and of Republicans in Congress and of Democrats in Congress who might feel more emboldened to talk about impeachment. The last thing I'll say about it is Trump is very, very extreme and unique in a lot of ways. And I think that if Nixon was the president after Trump, we might not see Watergate as being that scandalous. And that spooks me because it means that every week that Trump does something and you don't call for his impeachment, if the next president just comes up to that line, you also have a tougher time calling for their impeachment. Like the norms get weaker and weaker the longer you wait, which is not a call for calling for impeachment. I'm just saying that this stuff there is always the next presidency, and the patience we might have about doing it now might be patience that we have to suddenly live by for the next 10 presidential terms. And if we really believe that Trump is an existential threat to democracy, every day that we don't call him that means that every other president's allowed to be that much of an existential threat to democracy without you calling for impeachment, and that stresses me out.
So I've been taking notes, and my notes say Carlos Maza called for impeachment today. So Adam, your turn.
That's a good. I was going to say, I need to distinguish a little bit what I do and what Nick does. I'm much more sort of news person. I'm not really an opinion person, and Nick is in a position where, as an editorial board chairman, or whatever they call him, he can call for impeachment. I don't think that's something that newspaper reporters should be doing, frankly. To me, though, and that was a great question about whether or not any newspaper called for impeachment of Nixon back in the 70s. I'm actually older than you, believe it or not, but I actually don't remember. I was in Greece.
Somebody Google this.
Adam, there are people older than me. Not many, admittedly.
But anyway, the impeachment is more difficult. To me, impeachment, and this is going a little bit to what you're saying, is very much a legal case, right? It is like, is there enough evidence here to say that this guy broke the law and therefore he should be convicted of impeachment, right? And newspapers can at some point step in, newspaper editorial boards can sort of step in at some point and say, we think there's enough evidence here for the House to vote articles of impeachment or not. I mean, I think that's the way it should work. It's very, very, there is a process here for this. As a sidelight, I agree with you. I'm not sure that editorials calling for impeachment would have that much of an impact with this Congress, if that matters. More intriguing to me is the 25th Amendment. That to me is more a judgmental thing, right? I think that's less kind of a legal, evidentiary thing, investigative reporter thing. It's a judgmental thing. And I could see at some point editorial pages like Nick's or James Bennett back in New York for our paper making a decision that the guy is no longer fit to be president under the terms of the 25th Amendment, 25th Constitutional Amendment, and calling for the administration to act on those grounds. That seems to be more realistic to me. I want to be clear per the tally that you're keeping. I'm not calling for it. I'm being observational.
I'm sorry to say our time is up. Would everyone please join me in thanking this very, very good panel?